We all have those games that we buy or otherwise get a hold of, but we intentionally save for the right time, yeah? Those games that you can all but guarantee you'll enjoy, and so you wait until it can have maximum impact. I have legitimately been trying to find the right time to look at this game for probably around 4 years now, and I've wanted to play through it since release, especially after I got the game for free through the Epic Store, meaning I could push it to higher frame rates than on console. But something always got in the way, making clear that it wasn't the right time. Heck, technically this video was supposed to be done for Halloween, but I couldn't get the video for 13.2 and Lightning Returns done in time, and I had no space for extra footage. It was supposed to be my breath of fresh air after doing all that work on the 13 trilogy, and so, late or not, I decided that's what it's gonna be. And so, now we're here, and I've finally played through Alien Isolation. I'm not a fan of the Alien franchise. I've only ever watched Alien and Aliens, and both movies were fine. It's hard for me to judge them since they were both so influential that they felt well tread by the time I got to them. That's not the fault of the films, but it makes it difficult to find much interest in them. But if there was anything that makes me want to be a fan of the series, and jealous of fans of the series, it would be Alien Isolation. Transforming everything the original film did aesthetically and tonally so that it's playable, and then expanding on it, I'll spoil it right now. This game was an absolute joy to play through for me, from start to finish, minus a couple of small moments. I played Isolation on hard, because the game says that's the recommended difficulty, and I'm really glad I did. The difficulty options mainly change 4 things: how much damage you take, how many crafting resources you find, how aggressively the xenomorph hunts you, and how quickly he will learn from your actions and adapt. The first 2 changes are obvious in their implications. How quickly the xenomorph learns also is, for the most part. For example, I never really used flares to distract him through most of the game, since I'd instead actually figured they were supposed to very briefly keep him at bay when held up, since it's kind of like fire. Since that didn't work, and I had the flashlight to light the way, I didn't really experiment with them until the end, at which point they were new to the alien, and he was readily distracted by them several times in tight spots. Had I used them throughout the game, he might not have been. However, when working in conjunction with his hunting skills, this aspect of the difficulty can create interesting problems to work around. Hide in vents, waiting for him to pass by too much? Well, on harder difficulties, he'll eventually start learning and enter vents to get you. Same with lockers. In this way, I like that the xenomorph is treated as intelligent, but not hyper-intelligent within the world. Many people have survived with him stalking around the Sevastopol, the base we're on, for weeks now, so you can too. But that doesn't mean he won't pick up on your specific behaviors and exploit them, and when he tricks you because you underestimate him, you're almost guaranteed to be dead. It's important to know that the xenomorph doesn't retain knowledge after your death, thankfully. He too is reset back to his intelligence from the last time you saved, so you don't have to worry about bricking a save if your escape tactics continue to fail. The xenomorph ends up feeling just smart enough to be immersive, but not smart enough to feel realistically unfair. Early on, every close encounter that I somehow survived had me giggling to myself in amazed tension. Once that started to wear off and he became more normalized as an obstacle, it was more about his ability to learn that kept the tension up. I never knew when he'd had enough of my bullshit and would start using new tactics. I started to see myself and my growing arsenal as his equal. I couldn't beat him, but I sure could scare him off and show him his place. Which of course does mean you have combat options for dealing with both the alien, the synths on the station known as Working Joes, and the humans that sometimes might not be too friendly at this point. The combat itself is intentionally clunky and slow, because Amanda is an engineer. Your pistol is a revolver, and you don't have a speed loader or anything. So when you run out, at which point the game won't automatically reload, you have to hold the reload button for like 10 seconds before your gun is full again. You can cleverly stop it at any point if, say, you're in an emergency situation and only need 2 more shots instead of a full 6. But the gun still feels heavy, slow, slow, and unwieldy. The shotgun is easier to use, but also more or less has to be used close range, and only holds 4 shells. Molotovs, the flamethrower that devours ammo, pipe bombs that require tons of resources, and even some environmental hazards. You have options, but they're all very situation dependent. It's a nice spread that allows you to always feel like you have an opportunity open that'll probably work, but it might not always be the best one you could have hoped for. And none of these can kill the xenomorph intentionally. Which is why a lot more of your kit is actually about avoiding enemies altogether. Stealth is the name of the game here. You have EMPs you can make to temporarily disable working Joes, a stun baton that requires charges to do the same thing on a smaller, lower cost scale, noisemakers or flares to serve as distractions, flash and smoke grenades, etc. I tried to use these sparingly and rely primarily on raw stealth, just in case I really got stuck and needed something in an emergency or needed to make a med kit, but there's no denying that they are incredibly useful if thrown out in the right situation and not abused. Because of the dynamism of the AI for humans and the xenomorph, as well as the relentlessness of the working Joes, which are often paired with the alien, the game really emphasizes strategic thought and problem solving. This is what I wanted from games like Outlast or Amnesia, just with very intentionally clunky and limited combat thrown in, and a lack of frustratingly scripted jump scares. Which is worth noting, there really aren't any traditional jump scares in this game because so much of it is unscripted. Anyway, I feel like the game uses the core stealth horror mechanics that were popularized by the indie horror scene better than anything else I've personally experienced. You don't feel like you're just avoiding a random, spooky looking vision cone with legs, nor can the monster magically teleport all the time just to ensure that it can be around random corners like Slender can. Hiding isn't a be-all end-all, and it also isn't binary either. Enemies are also very, very rarely placed in ways that force you into a specific type of encounter. They might be set up in a way that makes avoiding certain types of encounters more difficult, but never impossible, especially if you use your tools. If the xenomorph doesn't seem to be that aggressive, that's because you're being particularly stealthy, not because he's scripted to only spook you instead of actually showing up in that area. If enemies see you, it's because they saw you. It'll never happen in a cutscene or whatever, and then force you to deal with the ramifications. While some situations might be a bit more difficult to handle in complete stealth, it's more or less always possible, even up to the last encounter with several xenomorphs at once, as the entire base is falling out of orbit. Humans can even be used as a distraction, since they interact with the xenomorph in the exact same way as you do. If they make too much noise, he might decide to pay them a visit, distracting the humans and also giving you a way to skate past the alien at the same time. And if you're pretty sadistic, you can even outright make this happen by throwing a grenade or something to make noise near those humans. The biggest weakness of this entire set of systems comes down to a small handful of rooms. Some of these rooms put the alien at an insane advantage, which makes trekking through without using tons of resources you might not have a game of luck. Others can lead to you accidentally creating messes for yourself that you then have to work through. This hallway right near the end is particularly frustrating, since there aren't a lot of options for ducking out into hiding. There are several places the xenomorph can drop down from, and you have to go back and forth through it several times, activating things in a specific order and proceed. Another situation I kind of created for myself was in this area full of working Joes. You have to go to 2 different areas on opposite sides of a central safe area with a save terminal to gain access to something in said safe area. Well, unfortunately, if you attract working Joes here, they'll likely follow you into one of those 2 rooms. If you save after this, they stay there. So now you've got 5, 7, 10 working Joes just chilling in that one room waiting for you. There are still ways through, as evidenced by the fact that I did make it through, but it was a bit rough since they don't always return to their posts. That's a bit of cool and unpredictable design throughout the rest of the game, and while it was funny here, it was also brutal. And I also had issues in the early tutorial about sneaking past humans, where it was unclear how the developers wanted me to hide to avoid being seen. All of the obvious spots for such an early tutorial didn't work. It turns out that I wasn't supposed to hide in the back of the room until they all had their backs to me. I wasn't supposed to hide just behind the box in the back and quickly go out. I wasn't supposed to rush out of the room and hide in the closer corner in the adjacent room, or try to sneak back behind the boxes in the larger room before anyone got close enough. I was supposed to specifically go into the adjacent room that joined the smaller one and the larger one and hide in the opposite corner, despite the fact that it feels like I'd be easily seen trying to get there. Early on, this made me really afraid that the game was going to be nothing but scripted trial and error, in spite of all the praise it got for dynamism. But luckily, that wasn't the case at all, and it's entirely possible that something odd was just going on with that section, because especially after finishing the game, expecting me to do something so specific with no indication of it feels very out of place. Expecting me to do something even half that specific feels out of place. Thankfully, you do have the ability to select from a few previous saves as you play, so you should never be completely out of luck. But if you really screw yourself by playing recklessly, I can see you probably having to do 30 minutes of gameplay again. Not really what I'd call a flaw with the game, but allowing scenarios to become that broken or designing them to be that luck-based isn't great, even if it's exceedingly rare. And I want to stress that, it is exceedingly rare and I was never stuck for more than maybe 20 minutes. Honestly, that's kind of my only personal complaint about the game. Even the graphics and sound, which you'd think would be dated by now, are still incredible. There was an insane amount of effort put into making this game feel not only authentic to the source material and the world, but also stylized in all the ways that allow it to feel like a cohesive whole. Despite going for realism, the use of things like chromatic aberration, clever lighting and shadows, film grain, and more all combines to create something that feels modern, anti-aliasing aside. And the sound design is the same way, whether it be the creaking of the ship or the alien scurrying around in the vents. It screeches and rattling when it senses something nearby, the sounds of the guns or the computers, the voice acting, and the directionality of it all. This is some of the best sound design in any game, still to this day.
Something of this. Come with me, please. No chance to dream.
As many have said, the only thing that doesn't particularly hold up visually are the character models, and the anti-aliasing. The characters are still good enough, but they do look aged and stick out. The transition into the different lighting of cutscenes also feels jarring, when I think going with the in-game lighting would have worked just fine. The cutscenes also didn't play back smoothly for me. Sometimes it's the little things that really immerse me, like the motion detector being able to be heard when an enemy is really close, or the fact that when you're holding it up, you have the ability to press a trigger on the controller to shift focus between the detector and the background, and it supports analog control, so you can choose exactly how much visual focus you want to give to the detector or the environment. Stuff like that just really gets me invested, because it's unique and useful without being a crutch or a gimmick. Valuable, but never needed. The biggest complaint I hear from others is related almost entirely to the length of the game. A lot of people, most reviews of the game, argue that it's too long and it runs out of steam by the end. I can't really say I felt that way. I feel like a part of the complaints with Isolation's length comes down to how people chose to play it. Though the Xenomorph is smart, and the inclusion of the working Joes and humans to contend with provides some variety in encounters, the core of the variety comes from the scenarios and levels. For me, finishing the game left me with around 14 hours of footage. That included all of my failures, a couple of places I got stuck or mildly lost, and some time where I had to pause for extended periods, so the game was probably more like 12 hours total. Contrast that with the 15 to 20 that the IGN review mentions, and I have a theory. Now, I want to be clear in saying that I don't think this review's criticisms of the length nor the low score are unfair. That would be nonsense because this is just one person's opinion within a place and time that was very different from now. I disagree with some arguments made within the review, like that the game pretends to be a first-person shooter at points, and I didn't find the Xenomorph unfair on hard whatsoever, outside of a very, very small handful of specific areas that you only have to traverse once, like I said before. The point is, while I disagree here and there, their score is fair either way, the validity of review scores as a whole aside. But, and this is just a guess based on how I've seen others talk about the game as well as my initial experience, I think they might have played the game in a way that it wasn't really intended to be played, based largely on our expectations about how games are generally designed. Alien Isolation has collectibles, you see, audio and text logs as well as ID badges for people who were on the Sevastopol, but it doesn't make any mention of them, nor show you any collection numbers when you pick them up. In fact, unless you explore beyond the map tab in your pause menu, you'll have no idea that they're even being logged at all. What's more, the game offers resources to collect for crafting and ammo for weapons, which you can actively search for in your environment. There are a lot of things to craft that can both be offensive, defensive, and stealth-oriented, but there are only a small handful of resources that you need to build all of the craftable options. You can only hold up to 3 of some of these resources and 5 at a time for others. Other than that, you can occasionally find blueprints to marginally upgrade these craftables. Despite the way the collectibles are handled and how limited your resource inventory is, I get the impression that people tried to explore the Sevastopol in the same way you would any other game world, the way you might in a game like Prey 2017, where you scour every single corner for absolutely anything you can find. But I really don't think Isolation is intended to be played this way, unless you're constantly crafting things you don't need, or obsessive about ticking menu boxes. Fully exploring each area is actually an awful idea. Not only does it mean you're in harm's way for a lot longer, but it also means you're doing more content in between saves and losing more progress if you die. Managing your resources even moderately well will see you always having access to at least a bit of what you need when you need it on hard. And the save system is designed to make you think carefully. It takes several seconds to activate the terminal. Doing so brings you out of stealth. You can be killed while trying to save if you use it recklessly, and after you save, you can't use that terminal to save for a couple of minutes. There are autosaves, but they're pretty much only used between loading screens and I think after cutscenes, which are pretty rare. So going 30 minutes between saves while you scavenge for every shiny you can find like a petty thief, or backtracking to the save terminal every few rooms does indeed sound like an awful, torturous experience that gets old fast. And it also is a good way for the alien to learn from you much faster than intended. For me, it was far more immersive to actually focus on survival, like Amanda is doing in Universe. The game gives you multiple avenues through areas, so that stealthing, surviving, and moving forward always has a nice flow to it that way. And it forces you to make snap decisions you might not have planned on, but it also ensures that future playthroughs will still feel fresh, because you're going to be pushed towards different sections of an environment by your enemies each playthrough, and if you didn't explore every room like you're robbing the entirety of the Imperial City in Oblivion, you'll be guaranteed to see new things each time. I too tried to explore the whole of every area for the first couple of hours, until I realized that it was ruining the experience and didn't provide me any mechanical value either. And I've talked to a couple of other peers who have said they either tried to play the game that way and enjoyed it less because of that, or were planning to play the game that way when they got around to finally trying it. And I think that's entirely down to the fact that we expect games to push us to explore every inch with a fine-tooth comb, and to find every collectible. We expect there to be UI indications of progress, and maybe even rewards for doing so. But Isolation doesn't seem interested in any of that. You'll never know you're collecting anything for a checklist if you don't actively keep track. I can also understand if maybe the loading screens on consoles were so long that it became arduous to do the backtracking the game asks. Because yes, you return to areas of the Sevastopol several times throughout the adventure. Or maybe the reviewer for IGN and everyone else really spent that much time just sitting in lockers doing nothing. After all, many third-person shooters in the last decade have tracked how long you spend in cover, and it can legitimately amount to a couple of hours if your playtime in the game is over 15 to 20 hours. I certainly didn't experience that, and probably spent like 10 minutes hiding under desks, and 5 minutes total in lockers because I didn't want the xenomorph to get wise to it and start checking lockers arbitrarily. And honestly, maybe that really is the problem. This genre of first-person stealth horror titles was still pretty fresh at the time. Maybe other games had instead conditioned people to be extra cautious, spend far more time than they should have spent hiding, and in turn smartened up the xenomorph to the point that the experience turned frustrating. Maybe that is what lengthened their playtime so much, and made it feel so repetitive and frustrating. But personally, I don't think it's really that bad, and for me, the length I played for and the backtracking added to the immersion. The Sevastopol felt like a real place that was just recently living, albeit in a limited corporate hellscape type of capacity. I enjoyed returning to areas because there was always something new about it, whether that be the environment itself changing, the enemies within changing, the defensive and offensive options I have being expanded, or even simply entering an area and almost immediately heading to a new section of it that I haven't been to before, because it was locked. These days on PC, if you've got even a vaguely modern rig and an SSD, I'd imagine the loading times are near instant like they were for me. So in 2022, it's hard for me to look at the act of heading through 2 5-second loading screens and a couple hundred meters of walking to the medical bay, opening a new door with my upgraded blowtorch, and exploring a brand new area as horribly padded backtracking, you know? Especially since you're only doing this once every couple of hours, and only really in the back end of the game. When there are humans messing around on the bridge my first time through, and I'm not sure whether they'll be hostile or not, and then the next time there's an alien, and then the final time there's 3 aliens and the place is a flaming disaster, is it really the same experience each time? Every single one of those situations completely recontextualizes how you want to approach the environment to the point that it's barely the same mechanically. And if you're not scouring every inch for collectibles, it won't feel like that environment is devoid of things to do and find. I want to be crystal clear in that I can totally understand how people could still feel like the game is too long. By the time I got to the start of mission 10 out of 18, so halfway through the game, I'd spent about 6 hours, so I expected the game to be no more than 12 hours total, with the potential to be shorter if the conclusion was less about stealth and more of a fancy set piece or boss fight. But instead, the back half of the game was around 2 hours longer than I'd expected. Still though, it didn't feel a second too long for me personally. I didn't hate dealing with the non-alien threats either, which is another complaint I've seen. I wish the humans were fleshed out. My mind thinks of something like the game I Am Alive, where people act differently based on the context of the encounter, like whether you have a gun or not, whether they know that it's loaded or not, etc. Instead, humans in isolation either seem to be hostile, completely non-hostile until you attack first, or they give you warnings and they'll be on a timer where they'll attack you if you don't leave. But despite the simplicity, they were still different from the Xenomorph and the Working Joes in terms of gameplay. Unless you have the flamethrower or the Xenomorph is far enough away that you won't get splash damage from a Molotov, you really don't want to face him at all. Humans I tried to avoid killing altogether. That being said, they're also the easiest to take down if you have to or want to. And again, they make great bait if you need that. But they also seem to have ridiculously realistic sightlines, rather than your standard gamified puny vision cones. Working Joes, by contrast, couldn't use guns, were slow and don't take cover like humans, and didn't have that great of vision. So combat is viable if you have to engage, but they also take a lot of ammo, and firing a gun is almost guaranteed to attract all of them in the immediate vicinity, or even the Xenomorph, which you almost certainly won't have the ammo for, unlike when facing humans. And unlike the rest of your options, you can't craft ammo, so you don't want to waste it. I also understand if people felt like the game didn't have enough pacing breaks. While you're not constantly under duress, this does feel like the type of game that could work well with some areas where there are no threats and you're just focused on puzzle solving for 20 minutes or whatever. I think of it like a classic Resident Evil after you've cleared out a puzzle room of zombies. If anything in the game was going to get tiring, it would be the fact that you're rarely actually safe, and when you are, it's usually either a set piece like the spacewalks, or like the little base of operations you enter halfway through. So you're rarely doing anything mechanically meaningful in these sections. In the end, Isolation didn't feel like a game while I was playing. It felt like an experience, and looking back at it, it still feels like that. It's one of those rare games that breaks out of its mechanical boundaries and feels organic rather than hand-tailored. And with modern hardware on PC that can run it so well, mods to play with, and near instant loading screens, I'd argue the game only feels better today than it did in 2014 at release. It's crazy for me to think that this game is almost a decade old, because if I didn't know any better, you could have convinced me it was released today. Aside from the weak anti-aliasing, I'd be none the wiser. In every way, Alien Isolation feels modern to me, in the best ways. Usually, licensed games age poorly. Heck, it amazes me every time I remember that this is a licensed game, because it doesn't feel like it, and I don't think of it that way. This game fits so well within the horror-focused sections of the Alien franchise, and is so polished and faithful in most ways, that it feels like it always belonged there. It would be a worse game without the license, and I don't think the license hampers it one bit. That's exceedingly rare. While I don't want to beat the dead horse that is Aliens Colonial Marines, it truly is amazing that these games are only roughly a year apart. Not only because Isolation is infinitely superior in terms of graphical prowess, animation, and visual and audio use of the license, despite also being a PS3 and 360 game, but also because it feels so much stronger in regards to how its game design melds with the license. Like, of course an Aliens game is going to be more action focused, while an Alien game is going to be more horror focused. But again, Isolation feels like it completely fits and respects that mold without being overly scripted, whereas Colonial Marines feels like a generic co-op shooter that they slapped aliens onto. It doesn't feel like an Aliens shooter. Overall, I really loved playing this game and would highly recommend it to anyone who thinks it looks interesting. I'm definitely going to go back to it many times in the future and maybe play on the hardest difficulty even. But what do you guys think? Have you played Alien Isolation? If you did so at launch, what were your thoughts then? And have they changed since then, or has this video given you a reason to give it another look? Did you even remember that this game came out on 360 and PS3? Seriously, that blows my fucking mind. Anyway, sound off in the comments below and I'll see you next time.